Good morning, everybody. My name is Tina Faze. I'm a strategic policy and communications consultant and an equity advisor. So as a strategist, day-to-day, I work with justice-seeking organizations and campaigns to secure progressive victories. And I rely heavily on Parkland's research to support the advocacy and political campaigns that I work on. But for me personally, the public win is sort of one side of the coin. We need to build the world we want internally. So I also bring a strong intersectional feminist lens to support organizations to embed equity and belonging internally in their systems, their policies, and their practices. And so as a longtime Alberta activist and campaigner, I'm just so pleased to be your facilitator today and to welcome you all here and everybody online to Parkland's 26th annual Fall Conference, to the last day of it. Now, I'd like to start us off this morning by acknowledging that we are gathered here on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Métis, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our community. For me, acknowledging territory is one of the ways I think through my own responsibility to decolonization as an immigrant who found refuge on these lands. And I think it's important that we ground our work like this morning, because meeting today here in this building means that we, unless we're First Nation, Métis, Inuit, or Indigenous, we are benefiting from the ongoing legacy of colonialism. It's impossible to deconstruct colonialism without understanding how land occupation is central to its continuation. And so as we've been talking a lot this weekend about what it means to dismantle the colonial, neoliberal, racist, sexist, misogynist systems of oppression that underpin this new right, it's inescapable for me how the struggles and liberation of Indigenous peoples are deeply linked to all our collective struggle for climate, social, racial, and economic justice. So for me, acknowledging the land is a reminder to be the active co-conspirator with Indigenous peoples in common struggle and solidarity that we so profoundly heard from Riley, Chilari, and others yesterday. And so on that note, it's a true privilege for me to introduce our next speaker, Emma Jackson, someone who spends, I would say, her days and nights and weekends actively organizing and building mass movements in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. So Emma Jackson is an organizer, writer, and campaigner based here in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. She grew up in the Canadian labor movement and first cut her organizing teeth in the student fossil fuel divestment movement, yay. She now works for the global climate justice organization 350.org, and she organizes locally with Climate Justice Edmonton and sits on the board of Alberta Workers Association for Research and Education. She is passionate about how we can build transformative mass movements, defeat Pierre Poilievre, and the rise of the far right and win the world working people deserve. Emma.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know from firsthand experience that it's really hard to rouse yourself out of sleep on a Sunday morning in order to talk about the relatively weak state of the left. But I'm really glad that you did so. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that we can kind of dig into things and start to talk about how we can build power in order to actually win transformative change in populist times. So I came this morning planning a sort of series of thanks of all of the people that I had to thank. And I want to start off by thanking the Parkland Institute for having me. My first job in Alberta when I moved here approximately 7 years ago was working for the Parkland Institute. They were really formative in helping to connect me to the left, and I'm deeply, deeply, deeply grateful for that. Thank you for all of the people who sent all of us emails chasing after me for months for a bio and a description of my talk. I know I'm probably not the only one. I wanted to start off my presentation by sort of situating myself in relation to what I plan on speaking about today. I was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario, which is a fact that I usually kind of disguise in talking to a lot of Albertans. It doesn't help me out very much in my organizing work. I was born and raised in a deeply political household. My My dad spent my entire life working for the Canadian labor movement. He was an economist for the Canadian Labor Congress, very involved in the left. And my mom, in contrast, worked for the federal government for my whole life. Oftentimes in the exact same departments that were sort of, very much in tension with the labor movement. So for employment and skills development Canada, for example. And because of that, I've come to realize that it was a really, really formative experience to constantly witness the back and forth and the power struggle that happens between movements and between government and how it is that those policies really impact our day-to-day lives. And I would say that it profoundly shaped my own theory of change, which is that I don't believe that we can elect the right people, well-intentioned people, who will then go off and do everything for us. I strongly, strongly believe that we need to build broad-based mass movements rooted in the working class in order to force the hand of government and put our hands on those levers of power and really sort of dismantle and transform the systems that affect our day-to-day lives. I think my parents are actually watching, so hi, Mom and Dad, if you are. I'm sure my dad will love this. So here's my dad on the left. You might recognize this guy, Bernie Sanders. That was back when he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. And then here's my mom and I on the front step of our home in Ottawa. I thought that I would start today off by telling a bit of a story. So in the spring of 2019, approximately a year before the pandemic hit, I traveled back to Ottawa in order to help organize this mass climate convergence where hundreds of young people from all across the country traveled, descended on Ottawa in order to really learn the skills of organizing, which is incredibly absent, I would argue, in the Canadian landscape. There's not a lot of places outside of the labor movement where you can talk about how to do one-on-ones, how to run people for office, how to you yourself run for office, how to canvass the theory of social movements. We don't have a Highlander Center. We don't have these sort of institutions that are incredibly important for building up a fighting left in this country. And that was a little bit of what we were trying to do. So this is us. I'm the one holding the clipboard really enthusiastically clapping, which all of the pictures actually from this event, I'm like somehow clapping, regardless of what was going on. There I am, I think, yelling and yeah, trying to get people to cheer. So this was us canvassing people on the Rideau Canal. This is the day after the convergence, and so you can kind of see, here's all of us. This is the sort of artwork that we made throughout the weekend. And here's the United Re-Roll convoy, which coincidentally descended into Ottawa on the final day of this convergence. And so there were maybe 100 people, residents of Ottawa, who decided that they wanted to host a counter-demonstration to the United Re-Roll convoy. Many of us, as you can tell, joined them. The tensions, it was very heightened, a lot of yelling. It was much more, the rhetoric was close down our borders, put Trudeau in jail, very xenophobic stuff. You're all familiar with it. And I found myself at one point during this demonstration sort of up against a police barricade, face to face with this man who was wearing a Make Canada Great Again hat. And this man was just yelling, like screaming in my face. There had been no sort of conversation or anything about, why is Justin Trudeau letting in immigrants when we can't take care of our own, classic stuff. All of my sort of de-escalation training just fell by the wayside. Like I had spent an entire weekend trying to train youth in de-escalation, and then I was like, never mind. And I yelled, and I was like, I came here from Alberta too, and I also hate Justin Trudeau. And you could tell he was just shocked, like could not possibly believe that there would be someone else on the other side who was from Alberta and who also had, a lot of issues with Justin Trudeau. And I'd love to say, then we went out for coffee and I talked him down and we burned his Make Canada Great Again hat. And that's not the point. That didn't happen. I wish it had. I think a lot of the time, I'm not trying to say we can just reason with a lot of hardened white supremacists. And at the same time, what became very apparent to me in that moment was that we were living through a sort of crisis of legitimacy, where the center was really no longer holding a degree of credibility. and there were sort of alternate solutions. The solutions that this man and I were reaching for couldn't be any further from one another, and yet our diagnosis of the problem, the degree to which we were looking at the political establishment in this country and being like, hey, it's not really working out for me either, as a young person facing down, the climate crisis and whatnot, but those solutions being, very contrasted. So fast forward to 2022, so just this year. As we know, the Freedom Convoy literally descended into this exact same spot in Ottawa. You can see this building was exactly where we were standing before. The Freedom Convoy really took over downtown Ottawa, and they had built so much power and were so much bigger, and yet that core sort of group of organizers, a lot of those same people, from evidence we know now, from testimony, came from that United We Rule convoy and really became the core of the Freedom Convoy. I was back in Edmonton, obviously, by this point, spent sort of weeks losing sleep over this, grinding my teeth at night. It was a terrible time. It probably was for a lot of you in this room, watching it unfold and being pretty scared about what it said. And there were a few things that I think became pretty clear to me in this moment. The right was organizing quite effectively, to their credit. They were breaking outside of insularity. There were a lot of factions back in 2019. The United We Rule convoy, in a lot of ways, was a pretty big flop. It was embarrassing. They thought it was going to be a lot bigger. They were meeting people where they were at, right? So they saw this frustration. They saw these material grievances that had really been exacerbated by the pandemic, and they were speaking to that. And in contrast, the thing that I think really stuck out to me the most in this moment and what kept me up at night was what the Freedom Convoy really said about the current state of the left in this country and the degree to which we were not, in contrast, reaching out. We were not tapping into people's material grievances in a really clear and effective way. And instead, in a lot of ways, we were tending towards insularity. I also think, and it's important to note, it says a lot about the degree to which we have been failing in deep anti-racist organizing when we have friends and family members and relatives who feel perfectly fine, walking out in the streets under flags with swastikas on them, and they say, well, yeah, but I'm not really about that. We have some work to do, and we need to get serious about it. Today, I don't just want to talk about the Freedom Convoy. I think it's come up a lot over the course of the weekend, understandably. I want to instead kind of break down some of the common myths and misconceptions that I think are circulating about the moment that we're in and how I believe that the left can and must effectively respond. So I'm going to give the disclaimer here that I don't have all the answers. I don't claim to have all the answers. I most definitely have blind spots, given my own positionality, but I also believe that organizing is a deep pedagogical process, and that means being put into struggle. It means us reflecting. It means us challenging one another and trying to build on our own understandings in order to do better. And it also means constantly learning, adapting, experimenting. So take this as an open invitation. Please challenge me. I want to start with the assertion that we are experiencing this crisis of legitimacy that I talked about, and that we're living through sort of populist times where the existing political leadership and the status quo are losing the credibility and the consent of the people. I think that's very, very clear in the United States. I think that was made very clear by the election of Donald Trump. I think a lot of the time, this is more muted in Canada for particular reasons. It's harder, to know when you've really crossed over into that threshold. But I think it's clear that the political establishment is starting to lose the credibility of the people. And when this happens, it means that, everything almost feels up for grabs. So we're starting to see, I would say, popular kind of rebellions from both the right and the left. And in a lot of ways, the left has been organizing, to their credit, in really inspiring ways. We saw solidarity with Wet'suwet'en and shut down Canada. There's the climate movement, which was bringing millions and millions of people out in the streets before the pandemic happened. The movement for Black Lives, which was massive, massive uprisings all across the country. But overall, I would argue that the left has largely been on the defensive. We haven't been able to flip over and go on the offense. And that's what I want to talk about. What does it look like to go on the offense? I also want to note, at the same time, this is obviously a simplistic sort of portrayal of this, but we're also sort of seeing this countercurrent that's pushing for a return to normalcy and the status quo. I think that exists a lot in our own spaces. I think there's just kind of like let's just go back to how things were. I would argue that absolutely needs to be resisted. And it's for a few reasons. Number one, returning to the status quo is not going to work in order to defeat the far right. And number two, we know that normal has not been working for billions of working people around the world, and it is making the world uninhabitable. So the status quo isn't working for the vast majority of us. So just for a second, I want you to try to just let go of everything that you think you know about populism. I know that it's been coming up a lot over the course of the weekend, but I say this because populism is often sort of equated with this far-right authoritarianism. It's seen as being inherently anti-democratic. And the reality is that the corporate media and the political class really benefit from us dismissing populism writ large. So here are some headlines, some worse than others. So populism's rise means worst will replace bad. Populists versus the planet, how climate became the new culture war frontline. So US midterms show that populism is now the biggest obstacle to addressing global warming. What actually is populism? I'm partial to Chantal Mouffe's definition, which is that populism is this construction of a political frontier, right? It's the creation of an us versus a them. It's a narrative strategy. There's nothing inherently wrong, I would say, in creating an us versus a them. And oftentimes it's a we the people versus a sort of corrupt establishment. So populism is not a specific regime or government, I would argue. It's not an ideology. I think that's critically important. Populism is not authoritarianism. I want to break this down a little bit more. We're going to get a little bit theoretical, but I promise I think it's applied. So here are some of the kind of key questions then to ask ourselves about populism. You're constructing this political frontier, and what's important is who is a part of the we? Who is left outside of it? Who is part of the them? Who or what is then considered a sort of threat to us? Who is it that we're being pitted against? And what are the values that define the we, that the we is sort of rooted in? And who gets to define all of this? Who's shaping it? When you hear populism being thrown about in the media, I would encourage you to step back and be like, wait a second, what is the exact type of populism here that we're talking about? For simplicity's sake, I think it's useful to sort of break this down into sort of two dominant forms of populism. And the first is the one that we're oftentimes, I would say, most familiar with, right? So this is a reactionary populism. And what's really important with this, if we kind of make our way down, reactionary populism is obfuscating the economic elite at the very top. It's kind of hiding and making cloudy this idea of banks, massive corporations, where wealth and power really lies in this top portion of the triangle. And sometimes, it kind of invokes it. So you'll hear Pierre Poilievre, for example, talking about Davos, talking about the World Economic Forum, talking about this sort of global economic elite, but it's never used in a way to directly channel that anger up to those at the very, very top. You will rarely, I would say, if ever, hear Pierre Poilievre, for example, going after Galen Weston in this country. That's just not going to happen, right? And so instead, what's important here is that reactionary populists will often sort of punch up by pointing at this social elitism, this sort of social and cultural class. So this is where they're going after journalists, they're going after the media, they're going after academia, they're talking about this sort of NDP liberal alliance, right? And they position that as being the very top. And at the same time, reactionary populism is always punching down at this other. And this is where it gets kind of a little bit more complicated and nuanced, I would say, in Canada than in the United States. But oftentimes you're punching down at migrants, at Jews, at Indigenous people, at queer and trans folks, definitely in this particular moment. You know, the like anti-wokeness is a clear sort of punching down. And this is important, it also manages to sort of gain credibility by also punching up within its own political party. There's a degree that you're trying to sort of gain this outside cred by being like, well, I'm not like them. I'm not like those kind of conventional, conservative career politicians, even though, as we know, Pierre Poilievre has been in office since he was like 5. I want to especially point out that this is so incredibly important because there are ways that I would say liberals and even the left feed into this. And the reason why the right punches up at this social and cultural elite is because the economic power at the very top, it feels like the weather to most of us. Most people are resigned to it, and it feels completely unmovable. It feels like something where there's nothing that we can do about it. And in contrast, condescension has a human face, an incredibly human face. And so when you're punching up at this sort of cultural elite, you're able to point out, you know, these condescending people who are looking down on you, and that's incredibly effective, and it makes people unbelievably angry. People become especially, I would argue, resigned to this economic power at the very top when our own progressive political parties aren't pointing it out, aren't naming it, aren't putting a human face on it. And that's a big mistake. Fortunately for me, got given, I would say, a really, really great example of this sort of punching up at a cultural elite, at a cultural kind of political class recently in this sort of condescension. Who saw this? Chrystia Freeland saying, cut your Disney Plus account. Oh, not very many. Okay, not big hand raisers, got it. Very recently, Freeland said, I'm going through my own budget, I'm looking, line by line, and I thought to myself, $13.99 for a Disney Plus account, we don't watch Disney Plus, we're gonna cut it. And really sort of encouraged Canadians to do the same. You're struggling to afford your groceries, why not cut your Disney Plus account? Look at the way that this feeds into the reactionary populism of the right? It was like a gift on a silver platter. Take this, it's awesome. So we have, this is probably, I'm guessing, The Sun. Freeland's Disney Plus gaffe, the latest condescending financial lesson from Canada's out-of-touch elite. Awesome. Freeland then had to walk this back, which in a lot of ways just reinforces it. It puts it back out in the media. She had to then say, I know I make, $250,000 a year. I know that, I'm not quite in touch with the lived reality of working people. Awesome for the right, once again. So she acknowledges that it was privileged. To their credit, I would say that the federal NDP responded to this in a really awesome way. So they said, how about liberals and conservatives cancel their $8.5 billion handout to big oil barons and impose a windfall tax on war profiteers? That's a great bridge to the next kind of populism that I want to talk about. And you can, see, obviously, Danielle Smith, really leveraged this opportunity as well. So the second form of sort of populism that I would say is the alternative and what will meet the sort of moment of reactionary populism is this inclusive populism. Inclusive, inclusionary. This is punching up by pointing at the economic power at the very, very top of this structure. So we're calling out Bay Street, we're calling out Galen Weston, we're calling out this mass profiteering through a moment of crisis, and we're pointing to the fact that these billionaires are making off like bandits while working people are struggling to get by. And this is also, it's calling out the sort of current leadership of the Liberal Party for failing to stand up and fight for everyday working people. So it's meeting people in that grievance and it's saying, I hear you. I hear you. I also believe that they're not doing enough. Importantly, it's confronting these sort of divide and conquer strategies of the right, of the UCP and the Conservative Party head on. It's not trying to skirt around the racism. It's not trying to say, ooh, that xenophobia, we don't really want to confront that and touch it. No, it's facing it head on, and it's saying, this is a strategy. This is a strategy that they're using in order to divide working people against each other so that they can continue to line the profits of the 4 billionaires in this country who make more money than like 3 provinces. It's articulating this we the people that actually includes all of us, regardless of race, regardless of ability, ethnicity, indigeneity, religion, gender, sexual orientation. It's articulating this strong multiracial working class, and it's saying we the people are the ones who have the power. We are the only ones that have the power to take those at the very top down. With this, it's really, really critical that we're articulating that the culpability lies at the very, very top, but responsibility for changing things lies with us. So we're not sitting back, we're not giving any sort of false hope. We're not saying if we change the minds of this billionaire class, if we just replace, who is in power, who is that corporate elite, then things will be good. We are the only ones that have the power to change that. I'm assuming by now some of you are like, yeah, sold. I, love this new populism. Let's do it. And there's probably others among you who are like, isn't this dangerous? Isn't it, a bit divisive? Doesn't it feel polarizing? And to that, I would say, here's the sort of economic reality as we know it. So Canada's richest families own more wealth than 3 provinces combined. There are CEOs in this country who will make more money in the first hour on January 1st than most families will make in the entire year. They make that money and they're like, okay, and they probably didn't even work for it. Shares. And on the subject of climate change, we know that billionaires' carbon footprints are 1,000,000 times bigger than the average person. This is polarization that we should be pointing out, I would argue. This is a division that is worth noting and that is worth putting a human face to. And it's hard to even really fathom this level of inequality. But it exists and it seeps into every single aspect of our day-to-day life. It's why when you go to the grocery store right now, you walk out and you're like, how is this single bag of groceries $46? How is that possible? We absolutely need to start pointing them out, I would argue. And a left populism, and I think there's been times where I get sort of called out on this, a left populism isn't enough. And it's really important to name that clearly. Again, this is a narrative strategy. It's this sort of discursive approach. That's not a substitute for building the real power that we need. It's not a substitute for a coherent strategy, and it's not a substitute for having a really compelling and inspiring vision. We need that ideology. Left populism is not an ideology, it's a frame. It's like the biggest possible way to get people in a funnel where then we start to build power with one another and to deeply politicize each other. I want to go back to the convoy for a second and talk a little bit about some of the things that I was witnessing that I found particularly concerning, and then I want to talk about movements. One of the experiences that I had, and that I'm sure, how many people, I know you don't like raising your hand, but how many people in the room kind of knew people who were somewhat sympathetic, would you say, to the convoy? Okay. Where's Fyodor? We need to get him in here and get them polling you guys, because I feel like that skews their data a little bit. My experience in sort of watching the convoy unfold was that there were so many people, and I would name explicitly, predominantly white people who were boasting about unfriending and blocking people on social media, their friends, their family, who even articulated the sort of shallowest sympathy for the convoy. They were like, F these people, I'm kicking them out of my life. And I understand that urge, I definitely do. But in contrast, I had friends, Indigenous friends. I had one friend in particular who's Punjabi, who spent hours every single day on the phone with Punjabi truck drivers in Ontario who were saying, hey, I'm really confused. Are these people out in the streets for me? Are they fighting for my working conditions? Are they fighting for me to have higher wages? And they were doing tireless work talking to those people and doing that political education and saying, here are all of the reasons why those people aren't out on the streets for you. And that's the type of work that we need to be doing. And that sort of tendency, that urge to dismiss, to alienate, to push away is exactly how we're going to continue to weaken the left in this country. We need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and having those hard conversations. And we need to hone the skills of how we do that. And I'm saying this as someone who has gone on a wild ride through deep sort of activist subculture and is sort of emerging and being like, hey guys, I don't think they have a lot of answers over there. I think we need to build power together and we need to figure it out. This is one of my sort of favorite kind of thinkers and theorists on this topic. Jonathan Smucker says, with insufficient organization and political power, activism too often contents itself with the futile exercise of speaking truth to power. And the hard truth is, the powerful are not overly concerned about our truth. They are perfectly okay with us standing on the sidelines protesting them, holding a righteous flame in the wind, shouting our truth until we are blue in the face. What they really do not want is for us to arm our moral protest with political power. Kind of speaks for itself. But we need to be building mass movements, ultimately. And this is really hard, right? Because neoliberalism has really stripped us of the skills, of the capacity, of the knowledge that we need in order to build broad-based mass movements. And so we need to acknowledge that this is a deeply sort of messy and complicated process because of the fact that this muscle has sort of atrophied, and many of the traditional institutions, I would say, and organizations that we've relied on have also really been profoundly impacted by neoliberalism. And so there's a sort of path dependency, there's strategies, there's approaches that aren't helpful and they aren't constructive. And at the same time, we can't put our faith in anyone else to get us out of the current sort of overlapping crises that we're facing. We need to build these movements ourselves. No one else is coming to save us. And this was very much, I think, influenced by my own experience in the climate movement, which is that we're mobilizing millions of people, and it's the same millions of people. So this insularity can also exist at a mass level, right? But there's still insularity. There's still the degree to which we are not expanding that base in the way that's needed. And the way that we need to do that is by thinking really deliberately and intentionally about the structures that we're a part of. What are the everyday sort of institutions that we're embedded in? That can be everything from, parent-teacher associations to unions to workplaces to your apartment building. But those are the places and the institutions that help to break you outside of this silo, because it doesn't just depend on these sort of like nebulous social relations that you've established with people that already agree with you. Who here is familiar with this? Okay, awesome. So this is often called sort of the spectrum of allies or spectrum of support. So here's sort of the movement. Those are the people that are like really organizing things, that are in leadership. Here are active supporters, so people who you can count on to mobilize. They're out there, they're voting in line with the cause. Here are passive supporters, so people who are like, oh yeah, I like passively agree with you, like climate change is a problem, I agree we need to do something to fix it. You have people who are sort of neutral on the issue, and then kind of same thing in the opposite direction. What happens, right, when we like erode those social connections to other people is that we're breaking ties and potential power all along this spectrum. We're becoming insular in our own sort of wedge of this, and we're like, oh yeah, I like talked to all my active supporters and I'm organizing. It's really hard to confront that truth. I know that like it has led me to a lot of despair and a lot of banging my head against the wall when I realize like, oh, I haven't been organizing. I've been saying that I've been organizing, and it is really hard to swallow that truth when you're like, that's not what I've been doing. I've been mobilizing a lot of people that already agree with me, and that's hard. And I keep saying, we need to meet people where they're at. We need to meet people where they're at. After I wrote that article about the Freedom Convoy, I spoke with, labor leaders, people in leadership in political parties, and they were like, tell us more. And I would say the words, we need to meet people where they're at, and I could tell, not all of them, but a lot of them were like, oh yeah, in the middle. We meet them in the middle. And I would be like, no! And wanted to jump out of my computer screen, like off of Zoom, and be like, that's not what I mean. So why? Why is that not what I mean? And I mean, I don't blame them. In a lot of ways, that's what it sounds like, right? You're like, oh, well, most people are neutral, and therefore we placate to the middle. Meeting people where they're at means meeting them in their lived experience, meeting them in their material reality, speaking to what it is that they are experiencing firsthand on a day-to-day basis, and it means framing bold ideas popularly. This took me years to understand. I would see the Overton window and I would be like, let's call for the most unthinkable radical thing, let's act in the most unthinkable radical ways, and then the Overton window is gonna come over here and it's gonna be great. That's not how that works, unfortunately. I'll give you an example. If we wanna move the Overton window on climate change in Alberta, I don't think it starts with saying, okay, we need to just keep, I don't blame the Alberta NDP for not saying we're gonna keep fossil fuels in the ground. And that's, how we're gonna move the Overton window. I understand that strategy isn't likely to work for them, but how about trying, there are these multi-billion-dollar corporations, they're making record profits. 1 in 5 Albertans is still accessing a food bank, so clearly there's a problem. And in the meantime, these fossil fuel companies aren't paying their taxes to rural municipalities. So what are we gonna do about it? Well, there's a solution. We can tackle the climate crisis in a way that can create millions of good jobs, that can improve your material working conditions, and that can strengthen our public services, right? We're speaking to values. We're speaking to something that, yes, in a lot of ways is really bold, and we're trying to frame it in the most popular terms possible, so people are like, yeah, I agree, we probably shouldn't be giving billions of dollars to oil companies that are already making billions of dollars. Most people on the doors will agree with you if you say that. So here's a good example. I hate that I keep being like, well, Pierre Poilievre, doing it pretty well. But this is a great example, right? What do people understand more than the cost of bread and the cost of butter? That is meeting people in their material reality. And the answers that he gives are bogus, are hollow, are dangerous, but talk about, meeting people where they're at. There's a sort of often neglected rule of thumb that exists when crafting demands. And I think this is where people get really stuck. They think, well, we need to win the middle. We need to win the middle. Here's a sort of intervention that I would make to that. You need to energize your base, and you need to isolate your opposition, and that is how you win the middle. Stop going to trying to win the middle first. Think about what is going to get hundreds of people out on the doors, what is going to convince hundreds of workers to start talking to their coworkers, what is going to excite people in order to grow that movement, and you are going to inevitably pull people over from these passive supporters in order to becoming active. And that is the most important point on this spectrum. Oftentimes we're focusing on what do we do about all of these people? Stop. Stop worrying about them. They'll come eventually. You want to focus on your passive supporters. How are you activating them? And I would argue this is the most important way that you can do that. You need to really, really clearly set yourself apart from your opposition. You need to inoculate people against them and against their arguments, and you need to make very, very evident why you're different, why the vision that you're putting forward is different than what already exists. Last thing I want to talk about, polarization. This is almost across the board always seen as a bad thing. People are like, oh, society's polarization, it's really bad. Here's a little secret. Polarization is a tool. It's a tool and it's a strategy that's used by people who are building movements, and it's used strategically, and oftentimes it is used ineffectively, I would argue. But we know that protest creates polarization. We're not trying to create protests and acts of civil disobedience that get everyone on board and that convince everyone, oh, I'm absolutely behind you. So when you see a protest and it makes you kind of uncomfortable and you're like, I don't really understand, that's intentional. That's part of the sort of sacrifice and compromise that's being made, and it's being made knowingly. So polarization, ultimately, it's about forcing people to pick a side. So it's driving a wedge quite deliberately in this spectrum of support. And so there's a calculation to be made around, how much support do you currently have before we polarize, and so how many members of the public are then going to kind of come on side. And oftentimes, the sort of refrain that is said most often is, I agree with your cause, but I disagree with how you're going about it. How many people have found themselves saying this? I said this 2 weeks ago. Apparently, throwing soup on a Van Gogh is my line where I'm like, no, that doesn't make any sense. What are you doing? But protest is intentionally confrontational. Again, the public might not like your tactics, but what ultimately matters is whether they start to choose your side of the issue. We know with the Freedom Convoy that the vast majority of people were like, I absolutely disagree with your tactic. I disagree with what you're doing. And what's important to look at is, well, where is public support then falling after an act like that? Like I said, not all polarization is good polarization. This is one of my most recent sort of favorite examples of this. So this first one here was Extinction Rebellion, stupidly getting up on a subway car in a working class community in London, disrupting all of these working class people from going to work in the morning. And this, on the other hand, is now that, they've had a change of heart and they're going to airports and they're stopping the private jets of billionaires from taking off. Good polarization, I would argue, not so effective polarization. These are hard calculations. It's really difficult to know this. I'm going to end by saying that, as I said, relearning the skills of democracy is incredibly difficult, and at the same time, we can't count on anyone else to do that for us. I know that I have found myself, in recent weeks and months feeling incredibly heartened by the amount of sort of labor activity, the amount of strikes that are happening, the amount of organizing that is happening here, I would say especially kind of south of the border. And we can't just assume that's going to come here. We need to build that ourselves. It starts with us. Mass movements are not guaranteed. Organization is not guaranteed. We need to do that, and it starts with having these conversations with each other and having conversations with the people who exist in your day-to-day lives. Thank you.
Hi, I'd love to hear more about how we can be on the offensive instead of the defensive, because of course that's easier said than done. I mean, as a hospital social worker, I see this all the time, even from patients I'm trying to help, and I'm seeing them for housing, and they're like, how about those Syrian refugees? They're taking all my housing money. They're not Canadian, I'm Canadian. Let's protect at home first. And I mean, as a social worker, I try to do my professional redirecting and saying, we have a housing crisis here, with or without the Ukraine refugees. But there's kind of a time and a place when it comes to things like that. But I'd love to hear more what you think about that, even in our personal lives, or when I talk to someone who supports the convoy, and they're, once again, blaming immigrants. And it's just like, this is obviously what the officials want to happen, is this distraction of us going against each other while they're going and passing bills and legislations that we don't. I do try to tell some of these people, you're upset about the immigrants, but they're also struggling to pay their grocery bills, which is what you're upset about also. So we have more in common than you think. But of course, finding those commonalities in an offense is not.
It's hard, right? I think I say we need to move from being on the defense to being on the offense, and we're not always in control of that, and we need to acknowledge that. We can't just flick a switch and be like, all right, we're going on the offense now. It's like that sort of positionality isn't always up to us. And I would echo some of what I've said. I think really starting again in thinking about what are the sort of institutions and those networks that are available to you that are meant to be building power, that are used as sort of vehicles in order to bring people in. For example, if you belong to a union, thinking about how do I get engaged in my union? How do I see this as a source of power? How do I see this as a way to get involved? And then connecting those issues. It's interesting, I have a lot of friends that work for labor unions. There is this sort of charitable tendency, and I think that's happened a lot in the sort of era of neoliberalism. I think it's happened a lot and has been magnified through COVID. I think there's almost like a de-politicized form of mutual aid that people gravitate to, of I want to make sandwiches for people, or I want to knit hats or whatever, and that's the sort of activism and the work that they want to do, and that's okay. And so I think that's where it comes to sort of meeting people where they're at and thinking about, okay, how do we start from something like that So for example, like knitting hats or doing sort of food bank drives or whatever that might be, that's a tactic, but it's a way that you can start to bring people together. I feel like, I'm throwing out a lot of like somewhat simplistic frameworks, but act, recruit, train is a really useful way to think about this. So how do you get people to take action like that? It can be action that you don't think is, like really politicized, or action that you see as not necessarily being useful. But I'm going to get people together and I'm going to recruit people out of that. I'm going to build relationships with them. And then I'm going to say, hey, why don't we come together and have a discussion circle? Why don't we invite someone in to talk to us about how we can start to change the conditions of our workplace or the conditions of our housing and our building?
So I really like what you said about meeting people in the conditions of their material reality. But what do you do, like I've experienced this in my own family, when they're not necessarily concerned about talking about that, or they mix it up with their unreality, their conspiracy theories? That's where I kind of lose my crap and just can't.
This is like a hard thing to accept, but I think there are times when people are like pretty far gone and you just have to be like, okay, that's not the best place for me to direct my energy and attention at this point. There are times when it's like people are, slipping and they're going there and we can pull them back. And there are other times where it's really important to just be like, there's not much I can do about that. And I will continue to, be here in some ways. Like maybe there's a need for distance, but it's not like I am isolating and alienating you out of my life forever, and there will never be a time where, maybe you come back and I'll be there and, ready to have those conversations. I think it is really important, going back to that sort of like spectrum of support. There are so many people, and I witness this every single day. There are so many people who want to get involved, who care about these issues, who don't know how, and they're just waiting to be told, they're waiting to be activated. And those are the people that I think we like really need to be spending a lot of our time and capacity and attention with. Again, with that form of sort of like condescension or like a looking down upon people. I think when people start to kind of go to these conspiratorial places, it's really important that we don't automatically kind of say, well, you're crazy, and just completely scold them, because nothing is going to move people to that far end of the spectrum faster than feeling as though they're being completely isolated, dismissed, and pushed to that far extreme. And that's really hard. Like, it's hard to hear those things and kind of try to approach that from a place of kind of curiosity. But I think that's what I would, say to that.
I understand all that you said, and I understand all of the issues that we have as citizens to get involved. But my question is, we have a system, we have a political system right now that we are basically ignoring. For example, I give you the NDP. You try to get involved in the NDP here in Edmonton, and if it is not something that they want, they're not interested either. It sounds to me like we need a university degree today to participate in our own affairs. Why aren't we, for example, trying to change the parties so that they become real parties? Like, if you go to Europe, for example, which doesn't work very well either, but it is an example that I experienced myself, they use their parties in a much, much better way than we do. And in that way, they can get all these active and not active, and because if you look at reality, if you have a family and you have kids, how the heck are you going to get to do all of this without neglecting your family? And the fact is that if we are all going to do that, then we don't have a society. I remember when Einstein said that, when you do the same thing over and over until you expect a different result, you are by definition, an idiot. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are all being idiots in a way, because the system in Canada needs a reform. Mm-hmm. Our political system is cancerous. We are ignoring that. We are trying to go against a system that is already bad. And we're trying to build on it in a way that we need to create a new Canada. Mm-hmm. The Canada that we have, the colonial system, will never change. And if you think, as an Indigenous person, and I am an example myself in my own life, if you think that you're going to change the colonial system this way, you will never get anywhere.
So first of all, If you left this talk thinking in any way that I have some sort of university degree in social movement theory, please leave that in this room. Every single thing that was up on these slides is stuff that I have either learned from being a part of trainings, that I've learned from reading. None of this was taught to me in university. And that's really critical to note, because I actually believe that our education system should be teaching people about social movements, should be teaching people about how to make change, should be teaching people about the importance of the labor movement. This stuff is not taught in university. Oftentimes we need to be self-taught. I know that there are labor folks in the room, and so this would also be an invitation. I think training is so critically important. I think extending those opportunities to people outside of the labor movement is a really critical way that we're gonna build powerful mass movements, that we're gonna have people showing up in solidarity. To political parties, 100%, I agree with you. The way that I think about this is quite kind of complicated, and I think that could be a talk on its own. I absolutely am someone, and I make no judgment to people who don't consider themselves to be sort of in this pool of people, but I am willing, and I think it's critically important that we engage with political power, that we engage with the system, that we do what we can. Absolutely, there's a role for sort of inside game. There's a role for trying to transform our political parties. What I would say is my own upbringing, my own life has really taught me that that work will ultimately be futile without having the mass movements in the streets as well. There's a short-term and there's a long-term game to this. So when Riley is talking about we need to build a new Canada, we need to be thinking sort of long-term about how are we building new institutions, how are we tearing down some of the existing institutions that we have. But absolutely, and I think maybe I'll take the opportunity now to say, if I was to give 3 pieces of advice to the Alberta NDP based on what I've been talking about, it would be embrace inclusive populism. I think this province is primed for it. I think so many people in this province have real deep material grievances. We need to start calling out that economic power at the very top, and that's not happening enough. I think we need a vision that we can rally people behind. I think that's critically important. I would argue that every single hand should be up if they were being inspiring, if they were really activating their base in the way that I'm talking about. I want to be inspired. We're in a critical election. I can admit to that. And at the same time, especially in a room like this in Edmonton, there's some critical self-reflection about why is it that every single person in this room haven't been out door knocking? And finally, they need to be knocking on every single door. There's a degree to which I think we write people off. We write entire ridings off. We say, that'll never work. We can never win there. This is part of meeting people where they're at. We cannot, at this stage, at least in the game, be relying on 2-year-old data and not going to every single door, because what you realize in canvassing, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, people's politics are all over the map. They're driven by values, there's particular things they agree with, and then as soon as you kind of hear partisanship, there is a degree to which you become hardened. People are movable, and we're not giving people the benefit of the doubt by talking to them and doing that deeper work. So yes, we need to engage in political parties. That is how I would say, sort of my advice for right now, how that could be done.
Can you talk a little bit about how to construct an organizing conversation? Because I think what you're trying to articulate is the difference between, a condescending, here's actually what you should know, versus an organizing conversation, which is, I think, what you're trying to articulate.
Depends a little bit, obviously, on the context. Something to be kind of aware of, and I think this is something that is counterintuitive to a lot of us, is that the other person in any sort of organizing conversation should be speaking the vast majority of the time. So you'll hear a sort of 80-20 rule. I'm asking you questions. I'm approaching you in a way where I'm curious. People are gonna leave that conversation not remembering what you've said to them, but they're gonna leave remembering what they said to you. And that's really critical. So asking people, I'll meet people in my building, for example, and I'll say, so how long have you lived here for? What's your experience been like with our landlord? What is one thing that you would change about this building? Which can feel kind of clunky, but talking to someone and saying, if you could change one thing about your workplace tomorrow, what would it be? and bridge from there. But you're asking a lot of questions and you're trying to find common ground. Yeah.
The last election in Alberta, the NDP ran a very poor campaign.
Yeah.
It was very negative, had no vision really. Sure, we had good policies. It was very bad. The other thing is, in campaigns, we don't seem to be flexible. We like to do our policies in an order that we're ready for, and yet the news is talking about something else, and
Right.
you're not responding to what the people are thinking about. You're right. They have had strategies now where you don't door knock on every door. You're just doing the ones and the twos of your supporters. And I disagreed with that too. I think you should be going to every door. The other trouble is, how come the left cannot get good slogans? We're too intellectual about everything.
Yeah.
If we have a slogan, it's going to be 2 paragraphs long. And yet the right can have little slogans that just are on everybody's tongue.
Yeah.
Help us with some slogans.
Okay, great. It's an important point, and I absolutely 100% agree with you. I really don't want to stand here and bash on the Alberta NDP. That's not my objective at all. But I think that it needs to be, here's the problem, here's the solution. And that can be quite difficult, but oftentimes what I'm seeing is, this is bad, or we're not going to do this, and there needs to be, what is that alternative? What are you going to do? What is your offer to people? So yeah, and the slogans, 100%. Slogans, yes, matter a little bit, and I actually think that oftentimes we get overly hung up on them, and I know I'm saying this in Alberta, and it's maybe a little bit different. Green New Deal or just transition, we can argue back and forth forever about that. People will say, that's a bad slogan, whatever, whatever. What actually matters is, a lot of the time these are floating signifiers, and what matters is the substance that you put behind it and the way that you talk about it. So if I went door knocking, or if I was canvassing people and I said, we're fighting for a Green New Deal in Alberta, people would be like, well, what's that? That's actually kind of useful. Sometimes it's useful for people to not instantly have a really kind of specified idea of what you're talking about, because then you're able to sort of, depending on that conversation, tailor it. Does that make sense? Sort of like speak to people's experiences in that moment. Sometimes I agree slogans are important, and I think we can get overly hung up on the terminology that we use instead of becoming more hung up on how are we building power and how are we talking about it in order to make it a reality.
My name is Natalie Ott. I'm the director of the Alberta Environmental Network. We are the organization that ran the Defend Alberta Parks campaign in Alberta. We're really thoughtful about our tactics, our communications, and we were successful in our campaign in stopping these parks from being closed. I don't know if people here are familiar with the campaign. We challenge ourselves all the time to have an effective campaign that reaches people. It reached across political affiliations. We had 25,000 signs out for that, 17,000 in Calgary itself. Now what we've switched to is deep canvassing. A lot of the things that you're speaking to, Emma, we are going door to door, and we're being really thoughtful about the conversations that we're having with people, and talking about their life experience and letting them speak about themselves and talking human to human. And it's extremely labor intensive, right? We have Molly and Melanie doing this right now, and we need to build our core of people who will go door to door and who will volunteer. We have to really challenge ourselves within, I would say, environmental groups. That's what I'm familiar with. And I don't think that we do that enough and question the impact that we're actually having. We tend to do what we feel comfortable doing and really have to push the tactics and strategies. I wanted to just ask about that, the mentality within environmental groups, specifically, that's what I'm doing, to question what we are doing and having those awkward conversations amongst ourselves.
I think it's important to note that there's no like homogenous one environmental movement. I think there's like a ton of different sort of factions within it. There's all kinds of different strands. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about that is a really important conversation that needs to be had is, so I work for a global sort of climate justice organization. And I was saying this on Friday, I think the environmental movement has activated millions of people who have never been involved in movements before, because they're like, wow, this is a big sort of existential threat. And at the same time, So I think it's been sort of a mass on-ramp for people. I would say people with a lot of privilege, a lot of white folks, a lot of people who have, class privilege and so on. And that's really important. And we can't reject and we can't kick away those people. And we need to do the deep work of politicizing them. And I think sometimes there's a temptation of abandoning those people. And so I think the same principle applies of meeting people where they're at and doing that deeper work within, my own organization, for example. I do think there's sometimes this temptation or this sort of exhaustion of there's all these, boomers in the email again going on and on about how we can't talk about racism because the number one priority is climate change, and therefore, why are we wasting our time with Indigenous rights? Why are we wasting our time with all of these other movements? Those intersections are places of power. That is where we build the strongest possible movements, and that work isn't easy. It comes with a lot of patience, but I think if we kick down those on-ramps that millions of people are on, that millions of people that are white and privileged are on, that's how we get into sort of eco-fascist territory. That's how we activate them around climate change, and then we say, we're abandoning you because we don't want to do the hard work of having to talk about racism and white supremacy, and we need to do that. And we need to point and connect people to their own stake in that, and I think that's really important. We're not just talking about allyship. We're talking here about liberation. We're talking about the fact that we can all have a better future when Indigenous peoples have sovereignty over their own territory, when we've dismantled white supremacy.
What I really appreciated about your presentation, Emma, is that all the movements that you talked about came from the streets or from people, from real people. I think far too often we rely on political parties to be the leaders, and they're not.
Yeah.
None of these, including Polyev and all those folks, they're not leaders. They just get in front of a parade, and we need to create that parade. So
100%, thank you.